The empath's darkest upgrade: cold, calm, unreachable. And I want you to notice what happened in your body when you heard those three words together. Cold, calm, unreachable. Because something happened. Something either contracted with recognition or expanded with the particular relief of hearing something named that you have been living but couldn't articulate. And either response tells you something important about where you are in this story and why this episode found you at exactly this moment. Because this is not a title designed to alarm you. It is not a warning about someone becoming dangerous or a cautionary tale about sensitivity curdling into something cruel. Cold, calm, and unreachable, in the specific context of an empath who has finally undergone what I am calling the darkest upgrade, are not character flaws. They are the three most misunderstood symptoms of the most significant, most hard-won, most quietly extraordinary transformation a deeply feeling person can move through. And by the end of this episode, those three words are going to mean something completely different to you than they did 30 seconds ago. So stay with me, because what we are about to walk through is the most honest conversation I know how to have about what actually happens when an empath stops being available to be hurt and starts being something that the people who relied on her vulnerability were genuinely, profoundly not prepared for. Let's start with how we got here, because the darkest upgrade does not arrive as a choice. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to become cold, calm, and unreachable. Nobody sits down with themselves and constructs a new personality from scratch because the old one wasn't serving them. That is not how this works. And understanding that it is not how this works is essential to understanding what the upgrade actually is and why it carries the word darkest in its name. The darkest upgrade is not designed, it is earned. It is the cumulative result of an empath going through enough, feeling enough, absorbing enough, giving enough, losing enough of herself in the process of loving people who treated her depth as a resource rather than a gift, that something in her fundamental psychological architecture finally, permanently, and without asking anyone's permission, reorganizes. Not breaks, does not break, reorganizes. The way a bone that has been fractured and healed is not weaker than the bone that was never fractured. It is denser, more structured, built with material that was not there before the fracture. Material that the body produced specifically to address the damage and ended up producing in excess of what the repair required, so that what remains is stronger in the exact place it was broken than it ever was before the breaking. The empath who has undergone the darkest upgrade is that bone. What looks like damage from the outside, what reads as coldness and distance and an unreachability that unnerves the people who knew her before, it is not damage. It is density, built in the only place and by the only process that could have built it. Now let's talk about cold, because it is the first of the three words and the one that generates the most immediate misreading. When the people around a transformed empath describe her as cold, what they are almost always actually describing is the absence of something specific, the absence of her automatic warmth, the reflexive, immediate, regardless of context warmth that the empath used to extend to essentially everyone, the warmth that made every room she entered slightly easier, every difficult conversation slightly more bearable, every person in her orbit feel slightly more seen and slightly more held than they did before she arrived. That warmth was real. It was not performance, and it was not manipulation, and it was not strategic. It was the genuine, unmediated expression of a nervous system wired for empathy, operating without the discernment that would have told it to conserve, to ration, to ask whether this particular person, in this particular moment, actually deserved the full warmth before extending it automatically and completely. The transformed empath still has the warmth. The warmth does not leave. It is as present in her now as it has ever been, as real, as deep, as capable of the same extraordinary quality of care that made her who she was before the upgrade. What changed is the automatic. What changed is the unconditional extension of the warmth to every person who entered her proximity, regardless of whether they had earned it, regardless of whether they were safe, regardless of whether extending it would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. The warmth is now conditional, not in the way that makes love transactional, not "I will be warm to you if you perform adequately and cold to you when you don't." Conditional in the way that means it requires something from the recipient before it flows. Not a performance, not a test passed, but a demonstrated willingness to be in genuine relationship rather than simply in the vicinity of what she provides. The people who experience this as coldness are almost always the people who were in the vicinity. The people who were in genuine relationship with her barely noticed the change, because the warmth was always there for them, and it still is. Fuller now, more sustainable, coming from a place that isn't running on empty. Calm is the second word and the second misreading. And the misreading here is more subtle and in some ways more important to understand. Because the calm of the transformed empath is not the calm most people associate with emotional health. Not the calm of someone who has processed their difficult experiences, arrived at peace with them, and moved through the world in a state of gentle, accessible equanimity. That calm is real, and it exists, and it is beautiful. But it is not what people mean when they describe the transformed empath as calm in a way that unsettles them. The calm that unsettles people is something different in its quality. It is a calm that does not move when it should, by their estimation, move. It is the calm of someone who hears something designed to provoke a reaction and does not provide the reaction. Who encounters an attempt at manipulation and responds with a stillness that communicates, without a word, that the mechanism has been seen and is not going to work. Who sits inside a conversation that is trying to destabilize her and remains not cold, not defensive, not performing composure, genuinely, groundedly, completely unshaken. This calm is not the absence of feeling. The transformed empath feels everything that is happening in that conversation with the same acute sensitivity she has always had. She registers the intention behind the words, the strategy underneath the presentation, the gap between what is being said and what is actually happening. She feels it completely. She simply no longer converts the feeling into the destabilization that the other person was counting on. Because somewhere in the process of the upgrade, in the long and difficult passage from who she was before to who she is now, she developed something that no amount of sensitivity training or therapy or conscious intention can produce directly. She developed it through surviving. She developed the capacity to feel the full force of something directed at her and remain standing inside it. Fully present, fully aware, completely her own. This is the calm that unnerves people. Not because it is frightening, because it is impenetrable, in the specific way that cannot be penetrated by the tactics that used to work on her. And the people who relied on those tactics feel the imperviousness like a wall they cannot find the door in. Unreachable is the third word and the deepest one, the one that sits underneath both cold and calm as the thing those qualities are pointing toward. Because unreachable is not a description of someone who has gone emotionally dark, who has closed off, who has built walls so high that nothing genuine can get through. The transformed empath is not unreachable in that way. The people who love her genuinely, the people who show up honestly, the people who are in real relationship with her, rather than in a dynamic built on her limitless availability, they reach her. Easily. More easily, in some ways, than they could before the upgrade, because she is no longer divided between them and the 100 other people and needs and situations she was always simultaneously managing. She is present to them in a quality of way that the depleted, overextended, always giving version of herself could never quite manage, because genuine presence requires a self that is actually there to be present, and the self she is operating from now is more intact, more whole, more genuinely hers than any version of herself that preceded the upgrade. What she is unreachable to is something different. She is unreachable to the tactics that used to move her when she did not want to be moved. Unreachable to guilt deployed as a lever. Unreachable to the particular emotional manipulation that used to work on her with devastating efficiency. The performance of need, the strategic vulnerability, the carefully timed withdrawal of warmth designed to make her chase it. The reframing of her self-protection as selfishness and her boundaries as cruelty. All of it finds no purchase now. Not because she doesn't feel it. She feels it. Accurately. Completely. But because feeling it and being moved by it are no longer the same thing for her. And the space between those two experiences is where the upgrade lives. In that space, in the gap between what she perceives and what she responds to, in the stillness of a woman who has been through enough to finally know the difference between something worth moving for and something designed to move her for someone else's benefit. That is where the darkest upgrade actually resides. And what it produces in her, and what it does to every person who encounters her now versus who encountered her before, and why the word darkest is in the title at all, when everything described so far sounds less like darkness and more like a very specific kind of freedom. That is exactly where we are going next. The word darkest is in the title because the upgrade does not feel like freedom when it is happening. It feels like loss. It feels like the kind of loss that has no clean name, no culturally recognized grieving process, no ritual for marking the passage from one version of yourself to another, when the version you are leaving behind was the one everyone around you needed you to stay. It feels like darkness because it happens in the absence of light, not the dramatic darkness of a crisis that announces itself clearly and invites the kind of support that visible suffering tends to attract, but the quiet darkness of a transformation that looks, from the outside, like nothing in particular, and feels, from the inside, like losing someone you loved. The someone being lost is herself, the version of herself that felt everything and gave everything and stayed in rooms long past the point where staying was serving her. The version that loved with an openness that had no natural boundary because boundaries had never been safe enough to maintain. The version that was extraordinary in her capacity for connection and exhausted to the point of disappearing by the cost of it. That version of herself was not nothing. She was not simply a collection of wounds and conditioned behaviors and patterns that needed to be outgrown. She was genuinely, deeply loving in ways that most people never achieve. And losing her, even to something better, even to something stronger and more whole and more genuinely herself, losing her is a grief that the upgrade demands, and that almost nobody outside the experience understands well enough to witness properly. So the empath undergoes it largely alone, in the dark, without the language to explain what is happening to the people watching, and without the certainty in the middle of it that what is on the other side is going to be worth what the passage costs. This is why the word darkest is accurate, and why it is important that it stays in the title, rather than being softened into something more palatable. Because the empath, who is currently in the middle of this passage, needs to know that the darkness she is moving through is not evidence that she is going in the wrong direction. It is evidence that she is going in the only direction available to someone who has finally, genuinely, at the cellular level, run out of the capacity to keep being who she was. The darkness is not the destination. It is the corridor. But it is a real corridor, with a real duration and a real cost. And anyone who tells you the upgrade is simply a matter of deciding to value yourself more and then straightforwardly doing so has never been inside the specific darkness that precedes it, and has no adequate framework for what the passage actually demands. So let's talk about what the passage actually demands, because this is where the conversation becomes most useful for the people who are inside it right now, rather than the people who have already come through. The darkest upgrade demands, first and most fundamentally, the willingness to be misunderstood for long enough that the misunderstanding stops mattering. This sounds simple and is one of the hardest things a deeply feeling, deeply relational person can be asked to do, because the empath's sensitivity means she feels the misunderstanding acutely. She feels the moment someone decides she has become cold. She feels the withdrawal of people who preferred the previous version. She feels the narrative being constructed about her in her absence, that she has changed, that she has become difficult, that whatever happened to her has made her less than she was, rather than more. She feels all of it with the same fidelity she has always felt everything. The difference the upgrade produces is not that she stops feeling it. The difference is that she stops letting it govern the decisions she makes about who she is going to be. She feels the misunderstanding, and she does not correct course to resolve it. She remains in the direction she is moving, even when remaining in it means allowing people to draw conclusions about her that are wrong. Because the alternative, adjusting herself back toward the version of herself that produced their understanding, is something she is no longer able to do without a cost she is no longer willing to pay. This is new. This is the upgrade working. And it feels, in the moments when it is most active, like something between grief and defiance, between loss and the most quiet, most unperformative, most complete courage she has ever had to locate in herself. The upgrade demands, second, the capacity to sit with the specific loneliness of being more than the people around you have the framework to see. Because the transformed empath, operating from her new density, her new stillness, her new unreachability to the mechanisms that used to move her, she is not simpler than she was before. She is considerably more complex, and the complexity is of a kind that most people who are not operating from similar depth have genuine difficulty recognizing for what it is. They see the surface, the reduced warmth, the unshakable calm, the apparent distance, and they read the surface accurately as a change from what was there before. But they misread what the change means, because they are reading it through a framework that was built to understand the previous version. The new version requires a different framework to read accurately. Most people do not have it, and the empath, who can see clearly that she is being misread, who understands exactly what they are seeing and exactly why they are interpreting it the way they are, has to make peace with the fact that clarity about being misunderstood is not the same as being understood. She can see the gap between what she is and what they think she is with perfect precision, and she cannot close it unilaterally, because closing it would require the other person to expand their framework, and framework expansion is not something that can be done from the outside. So she sits with the gap. She lives alongside the misreading. And in doing so, she builds something that the always understood, always legible, always adapting herself to be readable, previous version of herself never had the opportunity to develop. A relationship with herself that does not require external validation to feel real. A sense of her own reality that is sourced entirely from the inside and does not need anyone's confirmation to remain stable. This is one of the rarest psychological achievements available to a human being. It is also one of the loneliest passages to walk through on the way to it. The upgrade demands, third, the relinquishment of the identity that was built on being the one who could be reached, because that identity was real, and it was meaningful, and it served a genuine function, not just for the people who depended on it, but for her. Being the reachable one, the available one, the one whose depth was always accessible to whoever needed it, gave her something that the upgrade requires her to grieve the loss of before she can fully inhabit what replaces it. It gave her a place in every room, a role in every relationship, a certainty about her own value that was outsourced to her usefulness in a way she had rarely examined, because examining it would have required a stillness she was always too busy to allow. When the upgrade removes the automatic availability, it removes with it the identity that the availability was sustaining. And the empath stands in the unfamiliar territory of not being the most reachable person in the room, not being the one everyone turns to, not being defined by her accessibility. And she has to discover in real time, without a map, who she is in the absence of all of that. This discovery is uncomfortable in ways that are difficult to fully articulate, because they touch the most foundational questions a person can ask about themselves. Not what do I do? Not what role do I play? Not how am I useful? But who am I? What is actually here when the availability is not? What does this self consist of? This self that is not organized around being needed, that is not structured by other people's access to it, that exists in its own terms rather than in the terms set by every relationship it has ever been inside. The answers to these questions arrive slowly, imperfectly, in the stillness that the upgrade creates, and they are the most genuinely hers of anything she has ever known about herself. But they require the loss of the old identity before they can be found. And the loss, again, is real. The loss is dark. The loss is the price of the upgrade. And it is not a small price. And anyone who tells you it is has not paid it. What she finds on the other side, and there is another side, there is always an other side for the people who do not turn back when the darkness becomes its most convincing argument for retreat, is something that has no single adequate word and requires several attempted descriptions before it comes close to being named accurately. She finds herself. Not the performed self, not the adapted self, not the self constructed through years of orienting every quality and capacity she had toward making herself more useful, more available, more digestible for the people who needed her to be something specific. The actual self. The one that was always underneath all of that survived everything that was layered on top of it, that waited with a patience and a persistence that she could not have predicted because she did not know, before the upgrade, how durable the actual self was. She finds that self, and she finds it intact, weathered, but intact, changed by everything it has been through, but not destroyed by any of it, still feeling, still perceiving, still capable of the same quality of depth and connection and extraordinary presence that was always her most genuine quality, but now operating from a foundation that is so much more solid than anything she was standing on before the upgrade that the difference is structural, not incremental. She is not slightly more herself. She is categorically more herself. And from that more herself position, every choice she makes, every relationship she enters, every room she walks into, and every room she chooses not to walk into, all of it is different. Not because the world has changed, because she has stopped changing herself to match what the world expected of her, and discovered that the version of her that remains when she stops doing that is more than sufficient, is in fact more than she knew was possible, more than she would have dared to hope for in the dark middle of the upgrade, more than the cold and the calm and the unreachable were ever able to fully communicate to the people watching from the outside. Who she is on the other side of the darkest upgrade is not the diminished, hardened, closed-off version that the misreading suggested. She is the completed version. The version that contains everything she always was and everything the passage made her, integrated into a self that is finally, fully, indivisibly hers. Cold to what should not move her. Calm inside what used to destabilize her. Unreachable to what used to reach her without her permission. And warmer, steadier, more genuinely present than she has ever been to everything and everyone that was always worth being present for. The darkest upgrade does not make her less. It makes her, for the first time, entirely.